In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And nowhere is this more evident than with the Orks, a race literally engineered for combat, born from fungal spores with an insatiable hunger for violence coded into their very DNA. These green-skinned Xenos live for the fight. They breathe battle like humans breathe air. They exist in a state of perpetual warfare, and when there are no enemies to fight, they'll gladly turn on each other just to satisfy that biological need for violence. The Orks are, in every conceivable way, the ultimate warriors. Nothing in the galaxy can make them back down. Nothing can make them retreat in true fear. And nothing can convince them that fighting is anything less than the highest purpose of existence. Except, as it turns out, for one very specific type of enemy. One particular war machine that the Greenskins will actively avoid engaging if given any other choice. And that enemy is the Heresy-era Dreadnought, those towering relics from the age of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, when the Emperor still walked among humanity and the technology of the Imperium reached heights that would never be seen again. This seems impossible at first glance. How could a race of beings who throw themselves gleefully into the most suicidal charges imaginable, who laugh as they're cut down by heavy weapons fire, who consider a good death in battle to be the ultimate achievement, suddenly develop something approaching caution or reluctance? How could Orks, of all creatures, decide that discretion might be the better part of valor? The answer lies not in cowardice, because Orks don't understand that concept, but in something far more fundamental to their psyche. It has to do with the very nature of what makes combat satisfying to an Ork mind, what constitutes a proper fight worthy of their attention, and what happens when an enemy fails to provide the visceral, brutal, physical feedback that Greenskins crave like a drug. And the Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, for all their devastating power and combat effectiveness, fail spectacularly at providing that feedback. To understand this phenomenon, we need to journey deep into the twisted psychology of the Orkoid races. We need to explore the arcane technologies that made the Contemptor and Leviathan Dreadnoughts such formidable weapons during the Horus Heresy. We need to examine what happens when an unstoppable force, the Ork Wag, meets an immovable object that doesn't fight back in the way the Orks expect. And we need to unpack one of the most interesting quirks in all of Warhammer 40K lore, a detail that reveals profound truths about both the Greenskins and the tragic decline of Imperial technology. Because here's the thing that makes this so fascinating. Orks will fight modern dreadnoughts. They'll throw themselves at Redemptors, Castroferums, even the occasional ironclad or venerable Pattern, with all the enthusiasm they bring to any scrap. They'll battle Space Marine, Terminators, Imperial Knights, even Titans, if the opportunity presents itself. They've fought the Necrons, ancient machine beings, who've been killing things since before most of the galaxy's current species evolved. They've clashed with the cold, calculating war machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They've even taken on the soulless killing machines of the Tyrannid hive fleets. But those ancient Contemptors, those terrifying Leviathans, those relics from an age when humanity's technology bordered on the miraculous, those machines that fought beside the Primarchs themselves during the Great Crusade, the Orks want nothing to do with them, and the reasons why reveal layers upon layers of fascinating lore, both about the Greenskins and about just how far the Imperium has fallen since its golden age. This isn't a story about Ork cowardice, because such a thing doesn't exist. This is a story about the fundamental incompatibility between Ork psychology and certain types of warfare. This is a story about what happens when beings designed to fight one kind of enemy encounter something their creators never anticipated they'd face. This is a story about the tragic irony that the Imperium's greatest weapons from its proudest era are so effective that they paradoxically repel the very enemies they were designed to destroy. So let's dive into the green tide and the ancient steel. Let's explore the Wah and the atomantic reactors. Let's understand why the most warlike race in the galaxy will look at some of humanity's finest war machines and collectively decide they'd rather be somewhere else. Because this quirk of the lore, this strange aversion tells us more about both Orks and Dreadnoughts than entire volumes of tactical analysis ever could. The Ork mind, built for war, craving the fight. To understand why Orks refuse to engage Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, we first need to understand what makes an Ork tick. And I mean that literally, because the Ork psyche is as much a piece of biological engineering as their incredible regenerative abilities, or their capacity to grow larger the more they fight. Everything about an Ork is designed to make them the perfect warrior, from the cellular level all the way up to their culture and society. The Orks weren't always the crude, barbaric Xenos we see in the 41st millennium. According to the deepest and most ancient lore, they're the degraded descendants of a race called the Krork, warrior servants created by the Old Ones during the war in heaven millions of years ago. The Old Ones were among the most advanced races to ever exist in the galaxy, beings of immense psychic power and technological sophistication who shaped entire species to serve as weapons in their cosmic wars. And when they needed warriors to fight against the soulless legions of the Necrons and the reality-warping horrors that would become chaos, they created the Krork. These weren't the relatively simple-minded Orks we know today. The Krork were sophisticated, standing nearly 12 meters tall, wearing armor that would have impressed even the Adeptus Astartes during the Horus Heresy. They were intelligent, organized, and equipped with technology that blended organic and mechanical elements in ways the modern Mechanicus can barely comprehend. But most importantly, they were engineered at the genetic level to be the perfect soldiers for the specific war their creators needed to win. Over millions of years after the fall of the Old Ones and the end of the war in heaven, the Krork degraded into the Orks. They became smaller, less sophisticated. Their technology grew cruder, and their culture simplified into the violent, anarchic mess we see today. But one thing never changed: the fundamental programming written into their genes, the biological imperatives that drive every aspect of their existence. And chief among these imperatives is the need to fight. It's not hyperbole to say that Orks need battle the way humans need food and water. It's a biological requirement encoded in their DNA. An Ork who goes too long without a proper scrap doesn't just become bored or restless. They become physically and psychologically distressed. The wag energy that flows through their society starts to stagnate. Smaller Orks get bullied more by larger ones, looking for an outlet. The whole social structure begins to break down because it's built entirely around the assumption of constant warfare. This need for combat manifests in ways that seem insane to other species. Orks will charge across open ground into withering fire, not because they're suicidal, but because the thrill of the charge and the prospect of getting into melee range outweighs any concern for their own survival. They'll fight with weapons that have a significant chance of exploding in their hands, because the possibility of a bigger explosion is worth the risk. They'll undertake the most ludicrous and dangerous engineering projects imaginable, building ramshackle vehicles and weapons that defy the laws of physics, held together as much by their collective belief that they'll work as by actual mechanical integrity. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss when they think about Ork psychology. Orks don't just need to fight, they need a very specific kind of fight. They need combat that provides visceral, immediate, physical feedback. They need to see the enemy bleed, hear them scream, feel the impact of their attacks landing. The sensory experience of battle is as important to an Ork as the victory itself, maybe even more important. This is explicitly stated in the lore. Orks dislike fighting machines because machines lack what the lore describes as a satisfying feeling or visceral quality to combat. When an Ork swings his chopper into an enemy, he wants to feel the blade bite into flesh. He wants to hear the crunch of bones breaking. He wants to see blood spray and watch his opponent stagger from the impact. When he opens up with his shooter, he wants to see his target react to being hit, whether that's flinching, falling, or exploding into meaty chunks. Machines don't provide that feedback. Hit a machine with a chopper, and you get a metallic clang. maybe some sparks. Shoot a machine, and unless you hit something vital, it just keeps coming at you with the same mechanical precision as before. There's no fear to smell, no pain to witness, no satisfying gurgle as your enemy dies. It's like fighting a training dummy that hits back. Technically it's combat, but it doesn't scratch the psychological itch that orcs need scratched. This isn't to say that orcs won't fight machines at all. They absolutely will, especially if there's no alternative, or if the machine in question is piloted by something organic they can eventually get to. They'll fight vehicles, they'll fight combat servitors, they'll even fight things like Necrons if the situation demands it. But given the choice between engaging a purely mechanical enemy and literally anything else, the orc will choose the anything else every single time. Now, you might be thinking, but dreadnoughts have organic pilots. There's a space marine inside that armored shell, a living, breathing warrior who can feel pain and fear. Shouldn't that be enough to satisfy the orc's need for visceral combat? And the answer is yes, but only if the orc can actually perceive that organic presence, if the combat provides enough feedback to remind them that they're fighting a living enemy rather than a walking tank. Modern dreadnoughts, for all their power, still provide some of that feedback. They move in ways that suggest weight and mass behind the armor. Their weapons make noise that sounds destructive rather than merely mechanical. When you damage them, you can see the effect. Panels get dented, systems start sparking, the whole machine might stagger or slow down. There's enough human element showing through the mechanical shell to keep it interesting for an orc. But Heresy-era dreadnoughts, that's a completely different story. The Contemptor pattern, atomantic perfection. The Contemptor pattern. Dreadnought represents something that was revolutionary during the Great Crusade and is effectively impossible to reproduce in the 41st millennium. It's not just a bigger or better version of the modern Castroferum dreadnoughts that most chapters feel today. It's an entirely different class of war machine, built using technologies and principles that have been largely lost to the Imperium. Relics from an age when humanity's understanding of physics and engineering reached heights that seem almost mythical to contemporary tech priests. When the Emperor launched the Great Crusade to reunite humanity across the stars, the Space Marine legions marched to war equipped with the finest weapons and armor that Terra and Mars could produce. This was before the Schism of Mars, before the tech priests split between loyalists and traitors during the Horus Heresy, before 10,000 years of technological stagnation and knowledge loss reduced the Mechanicus to a pale shadow of what they once were. The Forge worlds of that era didn't just maintain technology, they understood it. They could innovate, experiment, and create new patterns based on old principles. The Contemptor was developed during this golden age, drawing on knowledge from multiple sources, including the ancient Legio Cybernetica, the robotic warfare division of the Mechanicum. It incorporated technologies that the modern Mechanicus considers borderline heretical or simply impossible, systems that date back to the dark age of technology or were newly developed by forges that no longer exist. And at the heart of every Contemptor was a piece of near-miraculous engineering, the atomantic arc reactor. This wasn't just a more powerful engine than what modern dreadnoughts use. It was a fundamentally different type of power source, a miniaturized fusion reactor that generated energy on a scale that modern Imperial technology cannot match in anything smaller than a Titan. The exact principles behind its operation are poorly understood even by those tech priests who maintain the few remaining Contemptors, regarded as sacred mysteries passed down through ritual rather than genuine comprehension. But we know its effects. The atomantic arc reactor allowed the Contemptor to do things that should be impossible for a walker of its size. It moved faster than any dreadnought should, with a fluidity and responsiveness that made it seem almost alive. The servos and actuators powered by that reactor could match or exceed the strength of much larger war machines. But most importantly for our discussion, it powered the Contemptor's signature defensive system, atomantic shielding. Imagine a force field that surrounds the entire dreadnought. a barrier of gravitic distortion and energy that intercepts incoming attacks before they can touch the armored hull. This wasn't the crude void shields you'd find on larger vehicles, which flicker and fail under sustained bombardment. This was a sophisticated, self-regulating defensive system that could absorb tremendous punishment while maintaining its integrity. Bolt shells would detonate harmlessly against the shield. Las fire scattered into prismatic bursts. Even heavier weapons, the kind that could punch through ceramite armor like paper, found themselves absorbed or deflected by this protective envelope. The Contemptor's armor itself was already substantially thicker and better designed than what modern dreadnoughts carry. But with the atomantic shielding active, the machine became extraordinarily difficult to damage. You could hit it with everything you had, watch your shots connect, see the energy discharges as the shields absorbed the impacts, and the Contemptor would just keep coming, completely unaffected, advancing with mechanical precision to close the distance and bring its weapons to bear. And this is where this problem starts for the Orks. Remember what we said about Orks needing visceral, immediate feedback from combat. They need to see their attacks having an effect. They need that sensory confirmation that they're actually fighting something, not just wasting ammunition on an invulnerable target. When an Ork shoots at a normal enemy, even a heavily armored one, they can see the impacts. They can watch their target react, whether that's diving for cover, staggering from the force, or going down in a spray of blood and gore. Even if they're shooting at something tough like a space marine in power armor, they get feedback. The marine might shrug off the hits, but there's dust and sparks, maybe a dent in the armor, something to show that the attack connected and mattered. Shoot at a Contemptor, and you get nothing. The atomantic shielding absorbs your attack before it ever touches the actual machine. There's no satisfying impact, no visible damage, no sense that you're accomplishing anything at all. It's like shooting at empty air and getting frustrated that the air isn't dying. The Contemptor doesn't flinch, doesn't slow down, doesn't react in any way that an Ork brain recognizes as meaningful combat feedback. This gets worse when you consider the Contemptor's speed and mobility. Modern dreadnoughts move with a ponderous mechanical gait that clearly identifies them as large, heavy machines. They lumber across the battlefield with the inevitability of an advancing fortress, but there's no mistaking them for anything organic. Their movements are obviously robotic, servo-driven, mechanical. The Contemptor moves differently. Its more advanced servos and the incredible power output of its atomantic reactor allow it to move with an eerie fluidity that sits right in the uncanny valley between machine and living creature. It's fast, faster than something that size should be, able to run and even, in some accounts, perform maneuvers that seem impossible for a multi-ton walker. But it doesn't move like something alive. It moves with perfect precision, zero wasted motion, mechanical perfection in every step and turn. For an Ork, this creates a deeply unsatisfying combat experience. The Contemptor is too mechanical to feel like fighting a proper enemy, but too advanced to trigger the simple joy of smashing machinery. It's invulnerable in a way that feels cheap to the Ork psyche, taking hits without reacting, advancing without showing any sign of damage or wear, killing with cold efficiency while providing none of the visceral feedback that makes combat enjoyable. The weapons the Contemptor carries only make this worse. Where modern dreadnoughts might mount relatively straightforward weapons, assault cannons, las cannons, missile launchers, things that make satisfying noises and visible destruction, Contemptors often carry exotic armaments whose very function is barely understood. Keres pattern, assault cannons, forerunners to the Terminator weapons, but with even more devastating output. Gravis weapon systems, upgraded versions of standard Space Marine armaments that benefit from the Contemptor's massive power supply. Graviton guns, weapons that manipulate gravity itself to crush their targets. Plasma blasters that turn enemies into superheated vapor. All of these weapons kill with a clinical efficiency that provides minimal visual satisfaction. The Keres assault cannon doesn't just chew up enemies like a normal autocannon. It erases them with such overwhelming firepower that there's barely anything left to confirm the kill. Graviton weapons crush their targets into dense spheres of compressed matter. No blood, no dramatic death throes, just there 1 second and compressed into a ball the next. Plasma weapons vaporize their victims so completely that there's not even a corpse to confirm you hit something. For a race that loves to see the results of their violence, that gets genuine joy from watching enemies suffer the effects of their attacks. Fighting a Contemptor is like playing a video game with all the visual feedback disabled. Technically, you're doing damage. Technically, you're in combat, but you have no way to confirm it, no sensory input to satisfy that biological need for violent feedback. It's combat without the visceral elements that make combat meaningful to an Ork mind, and we haven't even gotten to the Contemptor's close combat capabilities yet. When one of these ancient war machines closes to melee range, it's equipped with Dreadnought close combat weapons that make modern power fists look primitive. These massive gauntlets aren't just strong, they're sophisticated pieces of technology that can modulate their power output, adjust their energy fields mid-strike, and deliver devastating attacks with precision that seems impossible for something so large. Hit an Ork with a Contemptor's power fist, and the greenskin doesn't get the satisfying crunch of a proper close combat encounter. The Ork gets atomized. The energy field surrounding the fist disrupts molecular bonds at the point of impact, and whatever it hits simply ceases to exist in any recognizable form. There's no struggle, no back and forth melee brawl, no chance to test strength against strength. The Contemptor swings, the Ork dies, and there's not even a body left behind to prove the fight happened. This is fundamentally incompatible with how Orks understand melee combat. To an Ork, getting stuck in means a proper scrap, trading blows, feeling your chopper hit enemy armor while your opponent's weapon clangs off your own defenses, a test of strength and ferocity where the biggest and meanest fighter wins through superior violence. Against a Contemptor, there is no scrap. There's just systematic extermination, death delivered with mechanical precision by an enemy that provides zero feedback, zero indication that it's even aware you're fighting back. The truly frustrating part, from an Ork perspective, is that the Contemptor is demonstrably a formidable war machine. It's obviously deadly, clearly powerful, undeniably a threat that would provide a satisfying victory if they could just destroy it. But the very features that make it so powerful in conventional combat, the shields that make it invulnerable, the weapons that kill without drama, the mechanical perfection of its movements, all of these things strip away the elements that would make fighting it psychologically rewarding for an Ork. It's like offering a starving man a meal, but serving it to him in a way that bypasses all his taste buds. Technically, you're providing nourishment, but you're removing everything that makes eating satisfying. The Contemptor is a perfect combat machine, which is exactly why Orks hate fighting it. It's too perfect, too efficient, too bloodless in its lethality. It wins fights by being technically superior rather than by being the bigger, meaner fighter. And Ork psychology can't process that as a proper battle. So when Orks encounter a Contemptor, pattern Dreadnought on the battlefield, something very unusual happens. These beings, programmed at the genetic level to seek out combat, to throw themselves into the most dangerous situations imaginable, to consider death in battle the highest achievement possible, will look at this ancient war machine and collectively decide it's not worth the effort. Not because they're afraid of dying, not because they think they'll lose, but because fighting it won't be fun. And for an Ork, combat that isn't fun might as well not be combat at all. They'll redirect their attention to literally anything else on the battlefield. If there are regular Space Marines nearby, they'll go after them instead. If there are Imperial Guard, perfect. If there's absolutely nothing else to fight, and their only option is the Contemptor or retreat, they'll sometimes actually withdraw to find a better fight somewhere else. This is a race that once fought a war against themselves because they ran out of other enemies. The fact that they'll avoid Contemptors when given any alternative tells you everything you need to know about how fundamentally unsatisfying these machines are to fight from an Ork perspective. The Leviathan pattern, when too much is not enough, If the Contemptor pattern represents the cutting edge of Dreadnought technology during the Great Crusade, then the Leviathan pattern represents something beyond cutting edge, something approaching the heretical in its disregard for conventional engineering principles and the lives of its pilots. Developed in absolute secrecy on Terra itself, hidden even from the tech priests of Mars, who normally had final say over all Space Marine war gear, the Leviathan was designed to be the ultimate siege engine, a war machine that could crack fortifications, destroy enemy armor, and dominate the battlefield with overwhelming firepower. The very existence of the Leviathan was controversial from the start. Many within the Mechanicum were deeply uneasy about its design, seeing it as a weapon purpose-built to fight and destroy the Mechanicum's own battle automata in some future conflict between Terra and Mars. The resource cost to produce a single Leviathan was immense, comparable to the construction of an Imperial Knight. And most damning of all, the systems required to power and control the Leviathan placed lethal strain on its pilot, burning them out faster than any other Dreadnought pattern, consuming their life force to fuel the machine's incredible capabilities. To understand just how powerful a Leviathan is, you need to understand its scale. This isn't just a bigger Contemptor. The Leviathan towers over its cousin pattern, a true colossus among walkers, so large and heavily armed that it sits in the same weight class as some of the smaller knights. Its armor is substantially thicker than even the Contemptor's impressive protection. Its atomantic arc reactor is oversized, generating power outputs that push the boundaries of what's considered safe or sane, even by the standards of the Great Crusade. And that reactor doesn't just power the Leviathan's weapons and movement. It powers defensive systems that make the Contemptor's atomantic shielding look weak by comparison. The Leviathan's shields were described as the most resilient field-augmented protection of any dreadnought created during the Great Crusade. When active, these shields could absorb punishment that would reduce lesser vehicles to slag, heavy weapons that would crack open land raiders, bouncing harmlessly off the gravitic barriers surrounding the Leviathan's hull. But shields are only the beginning. The Leviathan's armor itself represents the pinnacle of what the Imperium could manufacture at its height. Layered ceramite and adamantium plates thick enough to stop anti-tank weapons cold, reinforced at stress points, designed with overlapping fields of protection that eliminate weak points other vehicles might have. Even if something manages to penetrate the shields, it still has to get through armor that can tank hits from weapons designed to kill titans. The weapons the Leviathan carries are equally absurd. Where the Contemptor might mount a single heavy weapon on each arm, the Leviathan can carry weapons that most vehicles would struggle to use effectively. Gravflux bombards that create localized gravity wells capable of crushing entire squads into paste. Cyclonic melter lances that fire beams of fusion energy hot enough to melt through vehicle armor like butter. Storm cannons that spit out shells at a rate of fire that puts assault cannons to shame, each shell capable of penetrating heavy armor. Leviathan siege drills, massive rotating blades surrounded by disruption fields that can bore through fortress walls or rip apart enemy armor with equal ease. And these aren't just powerful weapons, they're impossibly precise. The Leviathan's targeting systems, linked to its oversized reactor and sophisticated machine spirit, can track and engage multiple targets simultaneously with accuracy that makes modern cogitator arrays look primitive. It can fire on the move without losing accuracy, compensate for recoil in real time, and adjust its aim mid-burst to ensure maximum damage. Everything about it is engineered for overwhelming, unstoppable destruction. Now imagine being an orc facing this thing. You're already dealing with all the problems the Contemptor presents. The shields that make your attacks meaningless. The mechanical precision that provides no satisfying combat feedback. The weapons that kill without drama or visible effect. But the Leviathan takes all of those issues and multiplies them by an order of magnitude. The shields don't just absorb your attacks. They make your attacks look pathetic. You can pour heavy weapons fire into a Leviathan and watch it shrug off hits that would destroy a normal vehicle. The shields don't flicker, don't show signs of overload. They just absorb everything you throw at them with contemptuous ease. Even if you manage to bring enough firepower to bear that you start to stress the shields, the Leviathan's armor underneath is so thick that penetrating it requires specialized anti-armor weapons, and even those might not be enough. The weapons it carries kill orcs before they can get close enough to do anything meaningful. The Gravflux Bombard doesn't just kill you, it erases squads from existence, pulling them into a localized gravity well and crushing them until there's nothing left but a compressed sphere of organic matter. The storm cannon doesn't give you the satisfaction of seeing who shot you. It just fills the air with so much high explosive ammunition that everything in its cone of fire ceases to exist. The siege drill doesn't let you test your strength against its power. It simply grinds you into paste faster than your brain can process what's happening. And if by some miracle you do manage to get close to it, to close into melee range where orcs traditionally excel, you discover that the Leviathan is just as devastating in close combat as it is at range. Its close combat weapons aren't just powerful, they're absurdly overpowered, capable of ripping apart heavy armor and infantry alike with casual contempt. And the Leviathan itself is so large and heavily armored that trying to fight it in melee is like trying to fistfight a building that's actively trying to crush you with weapons that weigh several tons each. But perhaps the worst part, from an orc perspective, is how the Leviathan moves. Despite its massive size and weight, despite the fact that it should move like a ponderous fortress on legs, the Leviathan is fast. Not as fast as the Contemptor, but faster than anything that large has any right to be. It can charge across the battlefield, can reposition itself with mechanical efficiency, can bring its weapons to bear on new targets with a speed that seems impossible for something so massive. And like the Contemptor, it moves with perfect mechanical precision. There's no rage in its advance, no bloodlust, no sense that you're fighting a living enemy. It's a killing machine in the most literal sense, programmed to destroy whatever its weapons are pointed at, executing its mission with cold efficiency that provides zero psychological satisfaction to anyone fighting against it. The lore tells us that the Leviathan's systems place such strain on its pilot that they burn out faster than normal Dreadnought operators, their life force consumed by the demands of controlling such a powerful war machine. But from outside, you'd never know there's anything alive in there. The machine gives no indication of the struggles its pilot faces. No sign that there's a living space marine inside desperately fighting to maintain control, while the Leviathan systems slowly kill them. It just advances, kills, and keeps advancing with mechanical inevitability. For orcs, this is even worse than fighting Contemptors. At least with a Contemptor, you can tell yourself you're fighting something that was once a warrior, that there might be some glory in bringing it down. The Leviathan is so overwhelming, so absolutely dominant in its application of force, that fighting it doesn't feel like combat. It feels like being systematically exterminated by an uncaring machine that doesn't even acknowledge you as a threat worth considering. There's no back and forth, no exchange of blows, no opportunity to prove your superiority through violence. The Leviathan identifies you as an enemy, allocates the necessary firepower to eliminate you, and executes that task with the same emotional investment that a human might bring to sweeping the floor. You're not a worthy opponent. You're a targeting solution, a set of coordinates for weapons to be aimed at, a problem to be solved through the application of overwhelming force. And the truly maddening part is that the Leviathan is demonstrably beatable. It's not invincible, despite its fearsome reputation. Concentrated fire from heavy weapons can eventually overwhelm even its reinforced shields. Sustained assault from multiple directions can find weak points in its armor. A well-coordinated attack by superior numbers can bring one down through sheer attrition, but doing so requires the kind of tactical coordination and sustained focus that orcs struggle with at the best of times, and all for an enemy that provides none of the psychological rewards that make such effort worthwhile. Why should an orc warband waste time and ammunition methodically wearing down a Leviathan's defenses when they could be fighting literally anything else? Why should they coordinate their attacks and focus their fire when the enemy they're fighting gives them no satisfying feedback for doing so? Why should they invest the effort required to bring down this monster when victory wouldn't even feel good because the whole fight was so mechanical and unsatisfying? The answer, increasingly, is that they shouldn't, and they don't. When Orks encounter a Leviathan pattern dreadnought, the response is often to give it a wide berth and find something more interesting to fight. Not because they're afraid. Orks don't do fear in the way other races understand it, but because fighting the Leviathan violates the fundamental principles of what makes combat enjoyable and worthwhile from an Ork perspective. It's too invulnerable to provide satisfying feedback when you hit it. Its weapons kill too quickly and efficiently to allow for a proper scrap. It moves with too much mechanical precision to feel like you're fighting a living enemy. And even if you do manage to destroy it, the victory feels hollow because you've just spent enormous effort and resources to bring down an enemy that never acknowledged your existence as anything more than a targeting priority. The Leviathan represents the tragic pinnacle of a certain kind of warfare design, a war machine so effective at killing that it becomes boring to fight against. It's too good at its job, so dominant in its application of force, that engaging with it stops being combat and becomes something closer to targeted extermination. And for a race whose entire existence revolves around the joy of battle, whose every cultural value centers on the thrill of a good fight, boring might actually be worse than deadly. The machine problem. Why visceral matters. We've established that Orks dislike fighting machines due to the lack of satisfying visceral feedback, and we've seen how Heresy-era Dreadnoughts take this problem to its absolute extreme. But to really understand why this matters so much, we need to dig deeper into the Ork psyche and explore what visceral actually means to a greenskin warrior. When lore sources say that Orks find fighting machines unsatisfying because of the lack of feeling to it, they're referring to something fundamental about how Orks process combat experiences. It's not just about seeing blood or hearing screams, though those certainly help. It's about the entire sensory package that confirms to an Ork brain that meaningful combat is occurring, that the violence they're engaging in matters and is having the desired effect. Think about what happens when an Ork fights another organic creature, whether that's a human, an Eldar, another Ork, or any of the galaxy's myriad Xeno species. Every aspect of the fight provides immediate, visceral confirmation that combat is happening and having an effect. The Ork swings his chopper, and he feels the impact travel up his arm as the blade bites into enemy flesh. He hears the wet thunk of metal meeting meat, the crunch of bone breaking, the gurgle of blood filling a punctured lung. He sees his enemy's face contort in pain or fear. He smells the coppery tang of blood in the air, mixed with the acrid stench of fear sweat. If he's really unlucky, he tastes the spray of arterial blood that erupts from a particularly good hit. All of these sensory inputs combine to create a complete combat experience that satisfies something deep in the Ork's genetically encoded need for violence. It's not just that the enemy is dying, it's that the Ork can perceive them dying in multiple ways simultaneously, creating a rich tapestry of sensory feedback that confirms the violence is real and meaningful. Now consider what happens when that same Ork swings his chopper at a machine. The blade clangs off metal plating with a sound that's sharp and unsatisfying. There's no give, no sense of the blade sinking into something, just hard metal, meeting hard metal, with a jarring impact that might even hurt the Ork's hands if he swung hard enough. There's no blood, no screams, no fear smell. The machine doesn't react to being hit except maybe to adjust its targeting by a few degrees. If you're lucky, you might get some sparks or hear a servo whine in protest. But that's cold comfort compared to the rich sensory feast of fighting something organic. Even if the Ork manages to damage the machine significantly, the feedback is all wrong. Instead of blood and guts, you get hydraulic fluid leaking out, which doesn't smell or look right. Instead of death throes and final screams, you get systems shutting down with mechanical precision, motors going silent one by one. The machine might fall over or cease functioning, but it doesn't die in any way that an orc can understand or appreciate. This creates a fundamental disconnect between the violence the orc is inflicting and the psychological reward they receive for that violence. Their genetic programming says, fight things, hurt things, kill things. But the sensory feedback loop that's supposed to confirm successful completion of those imperatives never closes properly when fighting machines. The orc knows intellectually that they're fighting and potentially winning, but the lizard brain part of their psyche that actually drives the need for combat isn't getting the confirmation it requires. Heresy-era dreadnoughts take this problem and magnify it through advanced technology. At least when an orc fights a crude Imperial vehicle or a clunky servitor, there's some mechanical feedback. Armor panels get dented, treads get damaged. You can see the physical effect of your attacks even if it's not as satisfying as organic combat. But a Contemptor's atomantic shielding means you don't even get that much. Your attacks literally don't touch the machine. They're intercepted by an invisible force field and dissipated before they can cause any visible damage. Imagine the frustration from an orc perspective. You're firing your slugger at this towering war machine, watching your bullets hit, and then just vanish into the shields with absolutely no effect. No sparks, no dents, no indication whatsoever that you're accomplishing anything. It's like shooting at a ghost. The shields don't even flicker or show signs of stress unless you're hitting them with truly overwhelming firepower. From the orc's point of view, they might as well be shooting at empty space. This is psychologically devastating for a being whose entire worldview revolves around the efficacy of violence. Violence is supposed to solve problems. Hit something hard enough, and it should break. Shoot something enough times, and it should fall down. These are fundamental truths of the orc universe, but atomantic shielding violates those truths in a way that breaks the orc's mental model of how combat is supposed to work. The situation doesn't improve if the orc manages to close to melee range. Against most enemies, this is where orcs truly shine, where their natural strength and enthusiasm for close combat give them a significant advantage. But against a shielded dreadnought, getting into melee just means experiencing the same frustration at close range. Your chopper hits the shields and bounces off without effect. Your power claw connects, and the energy field absorbs the impact. You're swinging with all your might at an enemy you can see right in front of you, and you might as well be trying to punch smoke. And if by some miracle you do manage to penetrate the shields and land a blow on the actual armor, you're now fighting ceramite and adamantium plating thick enough to laugh off anti-tank weapons. Your chopper, which can cleave through human limbs and even lighter power armor, just scratches the surface. Your power claw might leave a dent if you really put your back into it, but that's about all. The dreadnought doesn't slow down, doesn't react, doesn't acknowledge that you've accomplished anything meaningful. Meanwhile, the dreadnought is killing orcs with cold mechanical efficiency. Its weapons don't give you the satisfaction of a duel or the thrill of trading blows. They just execute targeting solutions, pointing at orcs and erasing them from existence with firepower so overwhelming that there's not even bodies left behind to confirm the kills. The pilot inside might be experiencing terror or battle rage or grim determination, but none of that shows through the mechanical shell. The dreadnought's actions are identical whether its pilot is a cold-hearted killer or a terrified warrior forced into their shell against their will. This lack of emotional feedback is perhaps the most frustrating aspect for orcs, who are themselves so emotionally transparent in combat. When an orc is enjoying a fight, you know it. They're laughing and bellowing war cries. When an orc is angry, they show it through increased violence and creative cursing. When an orc is winning, they celebrate it with obvious enthusiasm. The idea of fighting an enemy that shows no emotion, provides no feedback about their internal state, doesn't change behavior based on whether they're winning or losing, is fundamentally alien to the Ork psyche. It's combat stripped of everything that makes it combat, in the Ork understanding of the term. There's no test of strength because the Dreadnought's shields make strength irrelevant. There's no test of courage because the Dreadnought doesn't experience fear in any way you can perceive. There's no opportunity to prove yourself the superior warrior because the Dreadnought isn't participating in a warrior contest. It's executing a combat algorithm. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Orks don't have complex emotional lives in most respects, but the emotions they do have run deep and are tied directly to their primary drive: combat. Take away the satisfaction of combat, and you're attacking something fundamental to their sense of self and purpose. It would be like if humans suddenly discovered that food no longer tasted like anything. You could still eat for nutrition, but the joy and satisfaction of eating would be gone. For Orks, fighting Heresy-era Dreadnoughts is like that. Technically you're in combat, but all the joy has been stripped away, leaving only a frustrating exercise in futility. And here's where it gets really interesting from a lore perspective. Modern Dreadnoughts, the Castroferums and Redemptors that dominate the 41st Millennium battlefields, don't create this same problem. They're still machines, still lack the organic feedback that Orks prefer, but they provide just enough visceral combat experience to keep Orks engaged. When you shoot a Castroferum Dreadnought, you can see the impacts on its armor. Bolt shells explode against its hull in satisfying bursts of light and sound. Las fire might not penetrate, but you can watch it scorch the ceramite, leaving visible marks that confirm your attacks are connecting. The Dreadnought might actually stagger from sustained fire, its servos straining to compensate for the impacts. There's feedback, not as good as fighting something organic, but enough to keep the combat loop functional. The weapons modern Dreadnoughts carry also tend to be more conventional. Assault cannons that spit out shells you can see tearing through the air. Lascannons that produce visible beams of energy, flamers that obviously roast their targets. When these weapons kill, they kill in ways that are visually apparent and satisfying to witness. You can see Orks getting chewed up by autocannon fire, watch them burn from promethium flames, witness them explode from missile impacts. The kills matter because you can perceive them happening. And crucially, modern Dreadnoughts are vulnerable in ways that Heresy-era patterns aren't. Their armor can be penetrated by dedicated anti-tank weapons. Sustained fire from massed infantry can cause cumulative damage. Get enough Orks with rockets or power claws concentrating on one Dreadnought, and you can actually bring it down, watching it slow, seeing pieces start to fail, until finally it topples over or explodes in a satisfying secondary detonation. That's a fight Orks can get behind. It's still not as good as fighting something organic, but it's visceral enough, provides enough feedback, offers enough of a challenge and reward loop that Orks will gladly engage. They might grumble about fighting machines, might prefer literally any organic enemy, but they'll fight modern Dreadnoughts with the same enthusiasm they bring to most combats. Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, by being too good, by being too invulnerable, by being too mechanically perfect, have crossed a threshold where they're no longer providing even the minimal visceral feedback that makes machine combat worthwhile. They've become combat in its most pure and joyless form, a technical exercise in applying force, with none of the sensory richness or emotional satisfaction that Orks need to consider combat meaningful. The irony is delicious. The Imperium created these incredible war machines to be the ultimate warriors, perfect in their execution of violence, unstoppable in their advance, utterly dominant on any battlefield. And in doing so, they made them so effective that they actually repel one of the galaxy's most numerous and dangerous enemy races, not through fear or superior firepower, but by being so good at killing that killing them stops being fun. The Lost Age, what made Heresy-era different? To truly appreciate why Heresy-era Dreadnoughts are so fundamentally different from their modern counterparts, we need to understand just how far the Imperium has fallen since the days of the Great Crusade. This isn't just about better weapons or thicker armor, though both of those are certainly factors. It's about a complete difference in technological philosophy, manufacturing capability, and understanding of the principles that make these war machines work. During the Great Crusade, the Imperium was at the absolute height of its power and capability. The Emperor himself still walked among humanity, a living god whose understanding of science and technology was unmatched. The Mechanicum hadn't yet split into warring factions during the Schism of Mars. The Forge worlds were at peak productivity, churning out weapons and armor using knowledge preserved from the dark age of technology or newly developed through actual innovation and experimentation. This was an era when the Imperium could build ships that made modern battlecruisers look like shuttles, when the Mechanicum produced weapons whose very principles of operation are now lost to time, when Space Marine legions marched to war in armor that the current Adeptus Astartes can barely maintain, let alone reproduce. It was an age of giants, both literal and metaphorical, and the technology they created reflected that grandeur. The Contemptor and Leviathan Dreadnoughts weren't just products of this era, they were showcases of what Imperium technology could achieve when resources and knowledge were unlimited. Consider the atomantic arc reactor that powers these machines. Modern tech priests, even those who tend to the few surviving Contemptors, don't truly understand how these reactors work. They can perform maintenance through rote, ritual, following procedures passed down from their predecessors, but ask them to explain the actual physics behind the reactor's operation, and you'll get mystical technobabble about machine spirits and sacred mysteries. This isn't just ignorance or superstition, though both of those factors certainly play a role. The atomantic arc reactor represents a level of engineering sophistication that modern Imperial technology literally cannot match. It's a fusion reactor small enough to fit inside a Dreadnought chassis, while producing power output that would be impressive on a starship. The magnetic containment systems, the fuel cycle, the heat dissipation, all of it requires materials science and precision manufacturing capabilities that the current Mechanicus has lost or can only replicate in the most limited quantities. The same is true for atomantic shielding. Modern Imperial forces use void shields on their larger vehicles and ships, but these are crude compared to what the Contemptor carries. A void shield is essentially a localized disruption in reality, pushing incoming attacks into the warp, where they hopefully dissipate harmlessly. It's effective, but brutish, and it has significant drawbacks. Void shields flicker and fail under sustained bombardment. They don't protect against melee attacks. They can be overwhelmed by sufficient firepower. Atomantic shielding works on completely different principles, creating a gravitic barrier that physically deflects or absorbs incoming attacks without relying on warp interactions. It's more stable, more reliable, and protects against both ranged and melee strikes. The energy requirements are enormous, which is why only something with an atomantic arc reactor can power it, but the protection it provides is vastly superior to anything modern technology can achieve at that scale. The weapons these dreadnoughts carry tell a similar story. A caress pattern assault cannon isn't just a bigger assault cannon, it's built to entirely different specifications using manufacturing techniques that are now impossible to replicate. The barrel design, the ammunition feed system, the recoil compensation, everything about it represents an optimization of the assault cannon concept that modern fabrication methods can't match. Graviton weapons, which some Contemptors carried, represent technology that was already rare and poorly understood during the Heresy. These weapons manipulate gravity itself, creating localized distortions that crush their targets or make them impossibly heavy. The physics involved are at the edge of what the Imperium ever mastered, and in the 41st millennium, functional graviton weapons are so rare that most chapters have never even seen one, let alone deployed one in combat. Even the more conventional weapons benefit from the superior manufacturing of the era. A Contemptor's lascannons don't just fire coherent light beams, they fire beams with tighter focus, better coherence, and higher energy output than equivalent weapons produced in the modern era. The materials used in their construction can withstand higher stress and heat. The power feeds are more efficient. In every measurable way, they're simply better than their modern counterparts. This superiority extends to every system in these dreadnoughts. The servos that drive their limbs are stronger and more responsive than modern equivalents. The armor plates are made from alloys that modern forges can't quite replicate. Close, but not identical. Good enough to maintain the shell, but not good enough to repair major damage. The targeting systems use cogitator architectures that are now considered borderline tech heresy, incorporating principles that the modern mechanicus views with deep suspicion. All of this combines to create war machines that aren't just incrementally better than their modern descendants, they're categorically superior, existing in a different class entirely. A Castroferrum dreadnought is a formidable weapons platform, certainly. A veteran space marine housed in a walking tank with enough firepower to dominate a battlefield. But it's recognizably a tank, a military vehicle with all the limitations that implies. A Contemptor dreadnought is something else entirely. It's a fusion of the best that Dark Age technology and Heresy-era innovation could produce. A war machine that transcends simple categories like tank or walker. It's fast enough to chase down infantry, tough enough to stand up to anti-armor fire, powerful enough to threaten heavy vehicles, and sophisticated enough to adapt to changing battlefield conditions with a fluidity that modern war machines can't match. The Leviathan takes this even further, incorporating technologies that some believe were personally designed by the Emperor himself. Whether that's true or just myth, we can't say, but the fact that such myths exist tells you something about how these machines were viewed even in their own time. They were special, rare, incredibly powerful, and entrusted only to the best warriors the legions could provide. The loss of the knowledge needed to produce these dreadnoughts represents one of the Imperium's greatest technological tragedies. It's not that the current mechanicus couldn't build something similar if they really tried, though that's probably true. It's that they've lost the conceptual framework that made these machines possible in the first place. The tech priests of the Great Crusade understood the principles behind their technology well enough to innovate, to modify designs for specific purposes, to push the boundaries of what was possible. Their modern descendants, by and large, don't. They know how to maintain what exists, how to follow ancient blueprints, how to perform rituals that preserve the function, if not the understanding of their machines. But genuine innovation, true comprehension of the principles involved, that's been lost along with so much else. This is why the few Contemptors and Leviathans that survive into the 41st millennium are treated as holy relics, sacred artifacts from a golden age that can never be reclaimed. Chapters guard them jealously, only awakening them in the direst circumstances, maintaining them with rituals passed down through centuries. Every one that's destroyed is a loss that can never be replaced, taking with it a piece of the Imperium's glory days. And from an Ork perspective, this technological superiority is exactly what makes them such unsatisfying opponents. The crude, barely functional technology that Orks use works precisely because it's crude. An Ork shooter jams constantly, might explode if you're unlucky, definitely isn't accurate beyond point-blank range, but when it does work, it provides immediate, visceral feedback. You pull the trigger, bullets spray out, you see them hit the target. Simple, direct, satisfying. A Contemptor's Keres assault cannon is so sophisticated, so perfectly engineered, that it doesn't provide that same visceral experience when it's used against you. The shells are too fast to see, too precise to dodge, too devastating to survive. You're not experiencing combat, you're experiencing execution by a machine so advanced it might as well be magic. The tragedy is that these magnificent war machines, these pinnacles of Imperial technology, are almost wasted on the Orks. They're designed to be unstoppable, and they are. But in being unstoppable, they become uninteresting to an enemy that values the struggle more than the outcome. A more advanced, more strategically minded enemy would recognize the threat and concentrate everything they had on destroying these relics. But Orks, bound by their genetic need for visceral combat, often choose to simply fight something else instead. It's a peculiar form of victory, repelling the enemy not through superior firepower, but through superior engineering that's too good to be fun to fight. The Imperium's greatest weapons from its greatest age succeed by being so overwhelmingly effective that they become boring. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, boring might just be the ultimate weapon against a foe that lives for the thrill of battle. The legacy of the old ones, ancient programming. To really understand why Orks have such a specific aversion to fighting certain kinds of machines, we need to go back millions of years, to the very origins of their species and the war that shaped them. Because the quirk that makes Heresy-era Dreadnoughts so frustrating for Orks to fight isn't an accident of psychology or a cultural preference. It's encoded in their genes, a remnant of programming inserted by their creators for very specific purposes during the War in Heaven. The Old Ones were one of the first species to achieve true mastery over the material galaxy. Ancient beyond human comprehension, possessed of technologies and psychic powers that made them seem like gods, even to other advanced races, they shaped worlds and created life with casual ease. They were the ultimate bioengineers, able to design entire species from scratch, tailoring every aspect of their biology and psychology to serve specific purposes. When the War in Heaven erupted, when the Necron Tyre transformed themselves into the Necrons and declared war on the Old Ones, with the backing of the Satan, reality itself trembled. This wasn't a war fought over territory or resources. It was a war for the fundamental nature of existence, with the cold, soulless undead legions of the Necrons seeking to exterminate all organic life, and the Old Ones fighting desperately to preserve it. The Old Ones created many species as weapons in this war. The Eldar were crafted as psychic warriors, able to manipulate the warp with natural ease. The Jokairo were designed as artisans and engineers, able to create sophisticated technology almost instinctively. And the Krork, the ancestors of modern Orks, were created to be the ultimate soldiers, able to thrive in any environment, reproduce at an incredible rate, and most importantly, fight with unmatched ferocity against the Necron legions. But here's the crucial detail. The Krork were specifically designed to fight the Necrons. Everything about their biology, their psychology, their instinctive knowledge, all of it was optimized for combat against soulless machine warriors who felt no pain, showed no fear, and had to be completely destroyed to be stopped. The Krork were tall, sophisticated, wearing advanced armor and wielding technology that blended organic and mechanical elements. But at their core, they were designed for one purpose: killing machines. And therein lies the problem, or rather, the specific programming that causes issues in the modern era. The Krork were engineered to find combat against machines satisfying enough to sustain them psychologically through the endless grind of the War in Heaven. They couldn't have the same aversion to machine combat that their degraded descendants would develop, because machine combat was their entire purpose. But the Necrons weren't simple robots or crude automatons. They were sophisticated war machines with physical bodies, warriors who could be damaged and destroyed in ways that provided clear feedback. When a Krork struck a Necron warrior with their weapons, the Necron's living metal body would show damage, might sever limbs, could be broken apart. The Necron would resist, would fight back, would demonstrate through their actions that they were being affected by the combat, even if they couldn't feel pain or fear. The Necrons were also dangerous enough, sophisticated enough, that fighting them required the Krork's full attention and capabilities. This wasn't fighting crude machinery that could be easily swept aside. This was fighting an enemy that could and would kill you if you didn't take them seriously. The challenge, the threat, the need for actual combat prowess, rather than just mindless violence, all of this made fighting Necrons engaging in ways that fighting simpler machines would not be. When the war in heaven ended, and the Krork found themselves without masters or purpose, they began to devolve. The sophisticated technology they carried degraded. Their advanced armor and weapons were lost or simplified. Their tactics became cruder. Their society more anarchic. Over millions of years, the Krork became the Orks, smaller, less intelligent, more primitive in every way that could be measured. But some things don't degrade, or at least don't degrade as quickly. The genetic programming, the fundamental biological drives and psychological quirks that made the Krork what they were, those persisted even as everything else simplified. And included in that programming was a very specific set of responses to different types of combat and different types of enemies. The need to fight, that's core Krork programming, still functioning perfectly even in the degraded form. The ability to grow larger and stronger through combat, giving them an evolutionary advantage in their endless wars. That's Krork biology working exactly as intended. The instinctive understanding of technology, allowing mech boys to build vehicles and weapons without formal training. That's Krork knowledge passed down at the genetic level. And the preference for fighting organic enemies over machines, the need for visceral feedback to make combat psychologically satisfying. That's Krork psychology adapted for a post-war in heaven universe. Because here's the thing, after the war in heaven, there weren't as many Necrons around. Most of them had gone into their long sleep, waiting out the ages in their tomb worlds. The galaxy was full of organic species again, perfect targets for a warrior race that needed to fight, but no longer had its primary enemy available. The Ork psychology that developed emphasized fighting these organic enemies, because that's what was available to fight. The genetic programming that had allowed Krork to find satisfaction in machine combat degraded, or was suppressed, because it wasn't needed anymore. Why maintain sophisticated psychological responses to fighting machines when the machines you were designed to fight have mostly disappeared and the galaxy is full of much more satisfying organic prey? But the programming didn't disappear entirely. It couldn't. It was too fundamental to what Orks are. Instead, it manifested as that preference for visceral combat, that need for specific feedback that confirms violence is having an effect. Fight an organic enemy, and everything works as intended. The Ork gets the sensory confirmation they need. Their psychological reward circuits light up. Combat is satisfying. Fight a machine, and something's missing. The feedback loop doesn't close properly. Combat feels wrong in ways the Ork can't quite articulate, but definitely feels. Now consider what happens when this degraded but still functional Krork programming encounters something like a contemptor. Dreadnought. It's a machine, which already triggers the "this combat won't be satisfying" response at a low level. But it's also wrapped in shields that make it effectively intangible, removing even the minimal feedback that fighting crude machinery might provide. And it moves and fights with a precision that seems almost Necron-like, that same mechanical perfection that Krork were designed to fight against, but modern Orks find deeply frustrating. The Orks' genetic programming is receiving contradictory signals. This is clearly a machine. Check the box for unsatisfying combat. But it's also sophisticated and dangerous enough that maybe it should be engaged seriously. But engaging it seriously doesn't provide the expected feedback, doesn't trigger the reward circuits, doesn't feel like proper combat despite obviously being a deadly threat. The whole situation creates a psychological dissonance that the Ork mind resolves by simply deciding this isn't worth fighting if there are any alternatives. It's like the contemptor is hitting an uncanny valley of Ork combat psychology. It's too mechanical to be satisfying, too sophisticated to be dismissed, and too different from Necrons, who the programming was actually designed to make fighting worthwhile, to trigger the deep ancestral responses that might override the surface-level aversion to machine combat. The Leviathan makes this even worse by being even more overwhelming, even more mechanical in its perfection, even further from anything the degraded Ork psychology can process as a good fight. It's so far beyond what Ork programming is designed to handle that the response is less, "this isn't satisfying," and more, "this isn't even combat in any meaningful sense." The cruel irony is that if Orks encountered actual Necrons, particularly ones fresh from awakening with their full capabilities intact, they might find them much more engaging opponents despite being machines. Necrons move in ways that suggest tactical thinking. They react to damage in visible ways. Their weapons and technology, while advanced, create effects that Orks can perceive and understand. Most importantly, Necrons fight with a purpose and adaptation that makes them feel like worthy enemies rather than just killing machines executing a program. But Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, designed by humans who had no knowledge of Krork or their psychological programming, accidentally hit every wrong note in the Ork psyche. They're mechanical enough to be unsatisfying, shielded enough to provide no feedback, and perfect enough in their execution to feel more like forces of nature than opponents to be fought. They represent Imperial technology at its finest, and part of what makes that technology so fine is precisely what makes it utterly uninteresting to an enemy programmed by the Old Ones millions of years ago. When worlds collide, Orks meet Heresy relics. While specific detailed accounts of Orks encountering Heresy-era Dreadnoughts are relatively rare in the lore, this scarcity itself tells a story. These ancient war machines are exceedingly rare in the 41st millennium, with most chapters possessing at most a handful of Contemptors and virtually no Leviathans at all. When they are deployed, it's typically in situations of such dire importance that the battle itself becomes the focus of recorded history, with the reactions of individual enemy units taking a back seat to the grander narrative. But we can extrapolate what these encounters might look like based on what we know about both Ork psychology and Dreadnought capabilities, and the picture that emerges is fascinating in its implications. Imagine a typical Ork WAG assault on an Imperial world. The Greenskins descend in their millions, crude spacecraft delivering mobs of boys eager for a good scrap. They crash into Imperial defensive lines with characteristic enthusiasm, choppers swinging, sluggers blazing, knobs bellowing orders that their subordinates mostly ignore in favor of fighting whatever's closest. It's chaotic, it's violent, and it's exactly what Orks live for. The Imperial defenders are giving ground, as they often do, against the sheer weight of the green tide. Space Marines have been dispatched to reinforce key positions, and standard protocol would be to deploy Dreadnoughts at critical junctures where their firepower can stem the Ork advance. A modern Castroferrum Dreadnought rolling into position would become a natural focal point for the fight, with Orks redirecting their attention to this new threat, eager to bring down the walking fortress. But then imagine the change in Ork behavior when what rolls into position isn't a standard Dreadnought, but a Contemptor pattern, one of the chapter's most precious relics, awakened from its long sleep because the situation is that desperate. The ancient inside has fought since before the Imperium was divided, has served the Emperor when he still walked among men, carries grudges against traitors who died thousands of years ago. The Contemptor strides into the battle with a fluidity that seems wrong for something so large. Its atomantic reactor powers up with a hum that's felt more than heard, and the shields shimmer into existence around its frame. It brings its weapons to bear, a Keres assault cannon on one arm, a massive power fist on the other, supplementary weapons mounted on its torso housing. The first Orks to encounter it charge forward with their usual enthusiasm. Slugger rounds ping off the atomantic shields without effect. Choppers swing and bounce off energy barriers with jarring impacts that hurt the wielders more than the target. The Contemptor responds with clinical efficiency, the Keres assault cannon obliterating the first wave of Orks, with such overwhelming firepower that there's barely anything left to confirm they existed. And here's where it gets interesting. The next wave of Orks, seeing their companions simply erased by this walking fortress that seems completely immune to their attacks, face a choice. The genetic imperative says, fight, always fight. Fighting is life, and life is fighting. But the psychological reality is, this isn't fun, this isn't satisfying, this doesn't feel like a proper scrap. Individual orcs might make different choices. The smaller, less experienced boys might try to redirect toward other targets, looking for space marines on foot or Imperial vehicles that don't have invisible force fields. The knobs, larger and more established in the warband's hierarchy, might try to rally their subordinates for a coordinated assault, because knobs have enough experience to understand that overwhelming firepower can eventually breach even atomantic shields. But that coordination requires an effort and focus that orcs struggle with at the best of times, and when the combat itself isn't providing the psychological rewards they crave, maintaining that focus becomes nearly impossible. Orcs start drifting away from the Contemptor, not in an organized retreat, but in a diffuse loss of interest. There are other enemies to fight, enemies that bleed when you hit them, enemies that react when you shoot them. Why waste time on this unsatisfying target? The warboss commanding the assault might try to force the issue, bellowing orders and physically throwing smaller orcs back toward the Contemptor. But warbosses maintain their authority through personal combat prowess, and even a warboss thinks twice about engaging an enemy that's demonstrating such overwhelming superiority. Lead from the front is the orc way, but leading your boys into a meat grinder that doesn't even feel like a proper fight. That's a good way to get challenged for leadership by a knob who thinks you've gone soft or stupid. The result is often a strange bubble of space around the Contemptor. The ancient Dreadnought stands at the center of a circle of relative calm, orcs flowing around it to engage other Imperial forces, while giving the Heresy relic a wide berth. The Contemptor can, of course, advance and force engagement, and when it does, orcs will fight back because they're in immediate danger. But given any opportunity to disengage, to redirect toward literally any other target, the orcs take it. From the Imperial perspective, this seems like a tremendous tactical advantage. The Contemptor can hold a position with minimal support, freeing up other forces for offensive operations. It can advance through orc lines without becoming bogged down in the kind of massive melee that usually develops around powerful units. Its mere presence creates operational space that modern dreadnoughts, for all their power, simply don't generate. But there's a downside that the Imperium might not fully appreciate. The Contemptor isn't actually destroying as many orcs as a more conventional force might, precisely because orcs are avoiding it. A modern dreadnought might get swarmed by hundreds of orcs, all trying to bring it down, and while the dreadnought would eventually succumb to that weight of numbers, it would rack up an enormous kill count in the process. The Contemptor, being avoided, kills only those orcs unlucky or stupid enough to be caught in its immediate vicinity when it advances. This creates a paradox. The Contemptor is more survivable and more effective at holding ground, but less effective at the primary goal of any military unit, destroying the enemy's fighting capability. The orcs aren't being defeated, they're being bypassed, and while that's tactically useful in the short term, it means more orcs survive to cause problems elsewhere. The situation with a Leviathan would be even more pronounced. This massive war machine, towering over even the Contemptor, represents such overwhelming force that orcs can perceive its threat from a distance. Before it even engages, before its weapons open fire, orcs would be looking for excuses to be somewhere else. The mob might nominally advance toward the Leviathan as part of their overall assault, but individuals would find reasons to veer off course, to investigate other targets, to suddenly remember that there was something interesting happening over on that other flank. A Leviathan advancing across an orc-held battlefield might create a wave of displaced greenskins spreading out ahead of it, orcs retreating, not from fear, but from a collective decision that fighting this particular enemy isn't worth the effort when there are so many other perfectly good enemies available. The Leviathan would plow through defensive positions with contemptuous ease, its overwhelming firepower clearing any orcs too slow or unlucky to get out of the way. But the majority of the green tide would simply flow around it like water around a stone. Imperial commanders without deep knowledge of orc psychology might interpret this as routing the enemy, believing the Leviathan is inspiring fear that breaks orc morale. But orcs don't rout in the traditional sense, not from fear, and certainly not from a single unit, no matter how powerful. What's actually happening is a collective psychological decision by thousands of orcs that fighting this particular enemy would be unsatisfying, and so they're going to fight something else instead. This has interesting strategic implications. A force of Heresy-era dreadnoughts could potentially carve a path through orc lines with minimal resistance, advancing deep into enemy territory, while most of the Wah simply moves around them to continue fighting more conventional Imperial forces. The dreadnoughts would accomplish their immediate tactical objectives, securing positions or reaching specific locations, but they wouldn't be degrading the orc fighting strength the way you'd expect from such powerful units. You might end up with a situation where a precious contemptor, awakened at great ceremony and deployed at a critical moment, finds itself standing alone on a stretch of battlefield that orcs have simply abandoned in favor of fighting somewhere more interesting. The ancient inside, who perhaps remembers the Great Crusade and expects enemies to show proper respect for their incredible war machine, instead faces the unique frustration of being too effective for their own good, so intimidating that the enemy won't even engage. This is perhaps the ultimate irony of Heresy-era dreadnoughts in combat against orcs. They're perfect weapons for holding ground against enemies who value that ground, perfect for standing in the breach against foes who must pass through them to achieve their objectives. But orcs don't really value ground, except as a place to find good fights. They don't need to pass through the contemptor to achieve their objectives, because their only objective is fighting, and they can fight anywhere. So the ancient war machine, the relic from the Golden Age, the walking testament to humanity's greatest technological achievements, stands ready for glorious combat, while the enemy it was meant to destroy decides that combat looks boring and goes to find something more entertaining to kill. It's the kind of anticlimax that perfectly captures the absurdity of 40K lore, where the Imperium's finest weapons succeed by being too good at a game the orcs aren't even playing. The meta-analysis, design versus lore. Looking at the relationship between orcs and Heresy-era dreadnoughts from a meta perspective, we can see fascinating tensions between what makes sense for game balance, what serves the narrative, and what's true to the established lore of both factions. This quirk of orc psychology, this documented aversion to fighting machines and the extreme example of heresy relics, exists at the intersection of several different design philosophies and storytelling needs. From a pure game balance perspective, Heresy-era dreadnoughts in the Horus Heresy game system are powerful but not insurmountable. Players running orc forces, whether in 30K or 40K when facing these relics, can and do engage them, because the game requires tactical decision-making rather than psychological roleplay. Your orc player isn't going to say, "Actually, my boys find this contemptor unsatisfying to fight," so they're going to ignore it and charge that tactical squad instead, even though that would be perfectly in character for actual orcs. This creates an interesting disconnect between tabletop play and lore. On the table, a contemptor is a target priority calculation. Does it threaten my objectives? Can I destroy it with reasonable force allocation? Will engaging it cost me the game? These are practical questions that have nothing to do with whether fighting the contemptor would be psychologically satisfying for orcs, and game mechanics necessarily trump characterization in a competitive setting. But from a narrative perspective, the idea that orcs avoid Heresy-era dreadnoughts makes perfect sense and adds wonderful texture to both factions. It reinforces that orcs aren't mindless monsters who fight everything with equal enthusiasm. They're a sophisticated enemy with their own psychology and preferences. It emphasizes that the ancient technology of the Imperium was so advanced that it transcended normal combat paradigms, creating weapons so effective they paradoxically reduced combat effectiveness through intimidation or dissatisfaction. The lore element that orcs dislike fighting machines due to lack of visceral feedback is established canon, documented in multiple sources. It's a specific quirk of orc psychology that gets referenced when explaining their behavior in various campaigns. But it's rarely explored in depth, because most Imperial forces use relatively conventional machines that don't trigger this aversion strongly enough to change Ork behavior in dramatic ways. Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, with their atomantic shielding and perfect mechanical precision, represent an extreme case that takes this mild preference and amplifies it to the point where it significantly impacts Ork tactical decisions. It's the logical extension of established Ork psychology applied to technology that pushes every button that makes machine combat unsatisfying. This makes for compelling storytelling. Imagine the scene: an ancient chapter relic, a contemptor that fought during the Siege of Terra itself, is awakened to face an Ork threatening the chapter's homeworld. The ceremony is solemn, the prayers elaborate, the expectations high. This sacred machine, which has turned the tide of battles for 10,000 years, strides forth to demonstrate the Emperor's might. And the Orks largely ignore it, because fighting it isn't fun. The bathos is delicious, the deflation of Imperial pomposity perfect. All that ceremony, all that history, all that advanced technology, and the barbaric Xenos are unimpressed because the contemptor doesn't bleed when they hit it. From a world-building perspective, this quirk also reinforces the themes of technological decline and lost knowledge that permeate 40K lore. The Imperium has fallen so far that even its greatest surviving weapons don't function as intended, not because they're broken, but because they're too good. Modern Dreadnoughts, cruder and less sophisticated, actually perform better against Orks because their very limitations make them more engaging opponents. This creates a fascinating parallel with how the Imperium treats its own technology. Just as the Mechanicus maintains ancient relics without truly understanding them, performing rituals that preserve function without comprehension, the Imperium deploys Heresy-era Dreadnoughts without fully understanding why they sometimes underperform against specific enemies. The technical superiority is obvious. The ancient patterns are clearly superior in every measurable specification, so why would they be less effective? The answer lies in psychology and biology that the Imperium doesn't understand and wouldn't consider relevant if they did. Space Marines and Tech Marines are trained to think in terms of specifications, armor values, weapon ranges, tactical applications. The idea that an enemy might avoid engaging because the combat experience is psychologically unsatisfying rather than because they fear defeat or prioritize other objectives, that's not a framework Imperial military doctrine really has. It's also worth considering what this tells us about the different kinds of warfare being waged in the 40K universe. The Imperium, particularly the Adeptus Astartes, fights wars to achieve objectives, defend the planet, destroy the enemy leadership, secure the critical infrastructure. Victory is measured in territory held, enemies destroyed, objectives accomplished. This is conventional military thinking that would be recognizable to real-world strategists. Orks fight wars to fight. Victory is measured in how good the scraps were, how much fun they had, how many impressive things they got to crump. Territory means nothing except as a place where fighting happens. Enemy leadership matters only as particularly impressive targets. Objectives are whatever the war boss thinks sounds fun today. Heresy-era Dreadnoughts are perfect weapons for conventional warfare and completely wrong for fighting an enemy who doesn't care about conventional warfare. They're so good at holding positions that they create space where fighting doesn't happen, which is perfect if fighting is a cost to be minimized, and terrible if fighting is the entire point. They're so efficient at killing that they make combat brief and one-sided, which is perfect for minimizing casualties and achieving objectives, and terrible for an enemy who wants prolonged, satisfying violence. The Imperium built these incredible war machines to dominate the battlefield, to be unstoppable forces that enemy armies would break against, like waves on a cliff. And they succeeded brilliantly, right up until they encountered an enemy who looked at their unstoppable forces and decided that breaking against them like waves on a cliff sounded boring, so they'd go find something more interesting to wave at. This is part of what makes 40K lore so rich and engaging. Surface level, It's a grim, dark setting where massive armies clash in endless war. But look deeper, and you find all these wonderful quirks and contradictions, places where the internal logic of different factions creates unexpected results. The Orks' aversion to Heresy-era Dreadnoughts isn't just a random bit of trivia. It's a window into how different species, with fundamentally different psychologies, interact with the same technology in wildly different ways. It also raises interesting questions about other ancient Imperial technology. If atomantic shielding and mechanical perfection make Heresy-era Dreadnoughts unsatisfying for Orks to fight, what about other relics from that era? Do ancient land raiders with Heresy-era armor create the same issue? What about Contemptors being used by Chaos Space Marines, where the corrupting influence of the warp might make them feel more alive and thus more satisfying to engage? These are the kinds of questions that emerge naturally from exploring the implications of established lore, and they demonstrate why 40K's setting remains compelling after decades. There are always new angles to explore, new implications to discover, new ways that the established rules of the universe create unexpected outcomes when applied consistently. The broader implications. What this tells us. The phenomenon of Orks avoiding Heresy-era Dreadnoughts reveals profound truths about both factions and about the nature of the 40K universe more broadly. It's a perfect encapsulation of several major themes that run through the setting, and examining it closely shows us layers of meaning that extend well beyond the specific interaction of greenskins and ancient war machines. First and most obvious, it demonstrates the tragedy of technological decline. The Imperium is collapsing slowly, losing knowledge and capability with each passing century, and this decline manifests in countless ways, both large and small. The fact that the most sophisticated technology the Imperium ever produced actually performs worse against certain enemies than cruder, more recent designs is a perfect metaphor for the Imperium's broader situation. They've created a technological infrastructure they can barely maintain, let alone improve upon. They worship machine spirits because they don't understand the machines themselves. They preserve ancient knowledge through ritual rather than comprehension. And when their finest achievements from the Golden Age prove imperfect for current conditions, they lack the understanding necessary to adapt or improve them. A civilization at its height would recognize that Heresy-era Dreadnoughts create psychological issues when fighting Orks, and would either modify the designs to address this, or develop different weapons specifically optimized for anti-Ork operations. The modern Imperium can do neither. They can barely keep the few surviving Contemptors and Leviathans functional, let alone modify them or learn from their principles to create something new. So they deploy these incredibly rare and precious relics in situations where they're not optimally effective because they don't understand why effectiveness might vary, and they lack the institutional knowledge to recognize the problem even if someone pointed it out. It's technological stagnation made manifest, the death of innovation preserved in walking form. Second, it illustrates how the Orks, for all their apparent barbarism, are actually a sophisticated threat that exploits weakness in unexpected ways. They're not mindless monsters who fight everything with equal enthusiasm. They're a species with specific psychological needs that drive their tactical decisions in ways other races might not anticipate. An Imperial commander facing Orks might logically conclude that deploying their most powerful units would be the best strategy, overwhelming the greenskins with superior firepower and technology. And against most enemies, this would be correct. But against Orks, sometimes deploying your most powerful units actually reduces their effectiveness because those units fail to engage the Orks in the kind of combat that satisfies them. This means fighting Orks effectively requires understanding Ork psychology, not just Ork capabilities. You need to think about what will draw Orks into disadvantageous engagements, what will make them fight in ways that serve your strategic objectives rather than their psychological needs. A commander who deploys a Heresy-era Dreadnought, thinking it will dominate the Ork assault, might instead find the Orks simply flowing around it to attack elsewhere. leaving this precious relic standing in an empty battlefield accomplishing nothing. Third, it reveals something fascinating about the biological programming that drives Ork behavior. They're creatures designed by an ancient race for specific purposes, and while they've degraded enormously from their original form, the core programming remains functional. This isn't learned behavior or cultural preference, it's genetic imperative, as fundamental to what an Ork is as their regenerative abilities or their capacity to grow through violence. The implications of this extend well beyond combat. If Orks have such specific biological drives around combat satisfaction, what other aspects of their behavior are similarly hardwired? How much of what we perceive as Ork culture is actually genetic programming expressing itself through social structures? The odd boys, the specialized Orks who emerge with instinctive knowledge of medicine or mechanics or other technical fields, are clearly an example of genetic knowledge transfer. How much of Ork society is built on similar biological foundations? And more importantly for anyone fighting Orks, if this genetic programming has such specific quirks and blind spots, what other vulnerabilities might it create? The aversion to fighting machines is one example, but there might be others, psychological triggers or tactical situations that Orks find equally unsatisfying or difficult to engage with effectively. Fourth, this phenomenon demonstrates the importance of morale and psychology in 40K warfare, even for species that don't experience morale in conventional ways. Orks don't root from fear, don't suffer from poor morale in the sense that human armies do, but they absolutely can become disengaged from combat if that combat isn't providing the psychological rewards they need. This is a different kind of morale consideration, not will they break and run, but will they redirect their attention to more satisfying targets? It's less about fear and more about motivation, less about courage and more about engagement. An Imperial force that understands this can potentially manipulate Ork behavior, using unsatisfying enemies to create areas where Orks won't fight, channeling the green tide toward more conventional units that will engage them more effectively. Fifth, it highlights the strange economy of rarity and value in the 41st millennium. Heresy-era Dreadnoughts are incredibly precious, irreplaceable relics from an age when the Imperium was at its height. The loss of even a single Contemptor is a tragedy, taking with it not just a powerful war machine, but a piece of history, a connection to the Imperium's founding that can never be recovered. Yet despite this rarity and historical significance, these relics can be less effective in actual combat than more common, more recently produced units. A standard Castroferrum Dreadnought, which most chapters can produce or acquire with relative ease, might achieve better tactical results against Orks than a 10,000-year-old Contemptor, precisely because the Castroferrum is cruder, less sophisticated, more vulnerable. This creates a perverse situation where chapters have to decide whether to deploy their most precious relics, knowing that while they're technically superior, they might not be strategically optimal. Do you risk an irreplaceable piece of your chapter's history in a battle where a more common unit would perform better? Do you leave your finest weapons in storage while fighting with inferior alternatives because those alternatives are actually more effective against the specific enemy you're facing? These aren't easy questions, and they reflect larger issues the Imperium faces about resource allocation, risk management, and how to make the most of dwindling supplies of ancient technology. Every time a Heresy-era Dreadnought takes the field, there's a chance it could be damaged or destroyed, and that loss is permanent in a way that losing a modern Dreadnought isn't. Finally, this whole situation is a beautiful example of the 40K universe's commitment to internal consistency, even when that consistency creates absurd or tragic outcomes. The lore established that Orks dislike fighting machines. The lore established that Heresy-era Dreadnoughts use atomantic shielding and advanced technology. The logical conclusion of these two facts is that Orks would find Heresy-era Dreadnoughts particularly unsatisfying to fight. And that conclusion, while perhaps unexpected, flows naturally from the established rules of the universe. This willingness to follow logical implications, even when they undercut the expected narrative, is part of what makes 40K compelling. The setting doesn't flinch from outcomes that might seem anticlimactic, or that undermine the awesomeness of certain factions. If the interaction of established lore means that the Imperium's greatest weapons from its greatest age are uninteresting to Orks, then that's what happens. And the setting is richer for acknowledging it. It creates a universe that feels lived in and real, where actions have consequences that make internal sense, even if they're not. What you'd expect from a purely narrative perspective. The Imperium's technological excellence becomes a liability in unexpected ways. The Orks' apparent barbarism conceals sophisticated psychological quirks. Ancient history reaches forward to influence modern conflicts through the medium of genetic programming millions of years old. All of these themes and implications flow from one simple piece of lore. Orks dislike fighting machines because of the lack of visceral feedback, and Heresy-era Dreadnoughts are machines that provide especially little feedback. It's a small detail, easily overlooked, but when examined closely, it reveals so much about the nature of this universe and the civilizations struggling for survival within it. Conclusion. Perfection's price. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium of man clutches desperately to relics from its golden age, ancient technologies it can barely maintain and cannot hope to reproduce. Among the most precious of these relics are the Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, Contemptors, and Leviathans that fought beside the Primarchs themselves during the Great Crusade and the tragic civil war that followed. These walking fortresses represent the pinnacle of what human engineering could achieve when knowledge and resources were unlimited, when the Mechanicum understood the principles behind their technology rather than just performing maintenance rituals. They are faster than modern dreadnoughts, tougher, better armed, protected by shield systems that border on the miraculous. They are, in every measurable way, superior to anything the 41st Millennium can produce. They are perfect weapons for the kind of warfare the Imperium wages, unstoppable engines of destruction that can dominate any battlefield they grace with their presence. And the Orks won't fight them. Not because they fear these ancient war machines, because Orks don't understand fear the way other species do. Not because they recognize their technical inferiority and make rational decisions about threat assessment, because Orks aren't rational in their approach to combat. But because fighting Heresy-era Dreadnoughts isn't fun, doesn't provide the visceral, satisfying feedback that Orks need to make combat psychologically rewarding, violates the fundamental principles of what makes a good scrap in the Ork understanding of the universe. The atomantic shields that make these Dreadnoughts so survivable also make them frustrating to engage with, absorbing attacks without visible effect, providing no feedback to confirm that violence is having an impact. The mechanical precision with which they move and fight strips away any sense of fighting a living enemy, reducing combat to a one-sided technical exercise in being systematically exterminated by superior technology. The weapons they carry kill with such efficiency that there's no drama, no struggle, no opportunity for the kind of back-and-forth violence that Orks crave. All of this combines to create enemies that are too perfect for their own good, so effective at war that they paradoxically become less effective against a foe that values the experience of combat over its outcome. The Imperium's finest achievements from its finest age succeed by being so overwhelmingly superior that they repel the enemy through boredom rather than firepower. It's a perfectly 40K situation, tragic and absurd in equal measure. The Imperium spent unimaginable resources creating these incredible war machines, preserving knowledge from the dark age of technology, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with Imperial engineering. They succeeded brilliantly, creating weapons that have served for 10,000 years, that continue to dominate battlefields across the galaxy, that represent everything the Imperium has lost and can never reclaim. And against one of the galaxy's most numerous and dangerous enemies, These perfect weapons are often less effective than their cruder descendants, precisely because they're too perfect. The technological decline that has crippled the Imperium in so many ways has, in this specific case, actually produced better results. Modern dreadnoughts, built with degraded knowledge and inferior materials, engage Orks more effectively because their very limitations make them more satisfying enemies to fight. For the Orks, this is just another quirk of the universe they inhabit, another example of why you fight some enemies and avoid others based on whether the scrap will be any good. They're not making complicated tactical calculations or strategic assessments. They're following genetic programming millions of years old, imperatives coded into their DNA by the old ones during the War in Heaven. Fight things that provide good combat feedback, avoid things that don't, and if you must fight unsatisfying enemies, do so only when there's absolutely no alternative. The Heresy-era dreadnoughts represent the ultimate expression of unsatisfying combat from an Ork perspective. They're machines, already a problem. They're invulnerable in ways that provide no feedback, making the machine problem worse. They kill with perfect efficiency, removing any opportunity for a proper scrap. And they move and fight with mechanical precision that emphasizes their nature as unliving war machines rather than worthy opponents. So the Orks look at these ancient relics, these treasures from humanity's golden age, these irreplaceable weapons that chapters guard with religious fervor, and they collectively decide that fighting something else would be more fun. It's not fear, it's not tactical wisdom. It's not even really a choice in the way other species would understand it. It's a biological imperative expressing itself, genetic programming that says, this combat won't be satisfying, trumping the general imperative that says, always fight. And in that simple quirk of Ork psychology, we see revealed all the tragedy and absurdity of the 40K universe. Imperium's greatest achievements undermined by their own excellence. Ancient programming from extinct races influencing battles 10 million years after their creators died. Technology so advanced it becomes a liability against enemies too primitive to appreciate its sophistication. It's the kind of detail that makes this universe so rich and compelling, where following the internal logic of the setting creates outcomes that are unexpected but make perfect sense in retrospect, where the interaction of different factions' psychologies and capabilities produces results that no one planned but everyone must deal with, where the grim darkness of the far future is leavened by moments of almost farcical irony. The Heresy era, dreadnoughts will continue to serve, will continue to be precious relics maintained with elaborate ceremony and deployed only in the direst circumstances. They'll continue to be effective against most enemies, dominating battlefields with the kind of technical superiority that only the Imperium's golden age could produce. They'll continue to be tragic reminders of how far humanity has fallen, physical evidence of capabilities lost and knowledge forgotten. But against the Orks, they'll also continue to be something else. Proof that in war, as in so many things, perfection can be its own limitation. That the best isn't always the most effective. That sometimes, crude but satisfying beats sophisticated but boring. That you can engineer the perfect weapon and still find it collecting dust because the enemy has decided your perfection isn't worth their time. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But not all wars are created equal, and the Orks, above all other species, understand this truth. If the fighting isn't fun, what's the point? The Heresy-era dreadnoughts learned this lesson the hard way, standing ready for glorious combat while the enemy looks elsewhere for a better scrap. It's a small tragedy in a universe full of greater ones, but it's tragedy nonetheless. To be perfect and to be ignored, to be superior and to be avoided, to be the Imperium's finest and to be the Orks' last choice. If you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40K's more obscure lore quirks interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of the grim darkness of the far future. Leave a comment, letting me know what other odd corners of the lore you'd like to see examined. What other unexpected interactions between factions deserve this kind of detailed analysis? The 40K universe is vast and full of fascinating details, and there's always more to discover when you dig beneath the surface of the endless war. For the Emperor, for the WH, and for the tragedy of perfection misunderstood, this has been Stories of Hammer. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the finest weapons can fail, not through weakness, but through excellence misapplied. The Heresy era. Dreadnoughts stand ready, perfect and lonely, waiting for enemies who'd rather fight something less impressive. It's the kind of irony that defines this universe, and it's exactly why we love it.